Good evening. I'd like to call to order the Albany City Council meeting for January 8th, 2018. Please join Councilmember Barnes in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
May we have a roll call, please?
Councilmember Barnes?
Here.
Councilmember Moss?
Present.
Councilmember Pilch?
Here.
Vice Mayor Nason?
Here.
Mayor McQuaid?
Here. Okay, item 3-1, Certificate of Appreciation, recognition of Councilmember Pilch for service as Vice Mayor. Could you meet me at the podium, please? So I have a certificate of appreciation. The City of Albany commends Nick Pilch in recognition of your service as Vice Mayor of the City of Albany 2017. And I just want to give you my personal thanks for all the work you did last year, and especially for the times that I wasn't able to attend meetings that you were there in my stead, and served very well. Thank you. Handshake? Done?
Yeah, very, very briefly, thank you very much for the formal presentation. I was very happy to do it. It was a very fulfilling job. Thank you.
Also, I just want to announce, since our last meeting was the passing of Ed Lee in San Francisco, and I did send a condolence note to Acting Mayor Breed, and we added a memorial statement on our website. Report on action taken in closed session. Council gave staff direction on how to proceed on the closed session items. Consent calendar. Consent calendar items are considered to be routine by the City Council and will be enacted by one motion. By approval of the consent calendar, staff recommendations will be adopted unless otherwise modified by the City Council. There will be no separate discussion on these items unless a council member or member of the audience requests removal of the items from the consent calendar. Any council member wish to pull an item?
512.
510.
Okay. Over here. I'm sorry, Nick, did you say 512?
Yes.
Okay. Rochelle, why don't you go first?
Yes, I apologize. I had my iPad. I turned in my old iPad for a new one a little while ago, so I have to pull. Maybe we could do 512 first, and then I'll.
You want to do 512?
Yes, certainly. Thank you. I just wanted to point out that this is was surprising for me to see this item from this 2015 item come up, and I exchanged some email with staff about it just for clarification. Apparently, it was, and so I'll just state it and to make sure that I understand. This was an item that should have been closed out some time ago, and when it came to your attention, you did indeed take the steps to close it out. And I also noted that it was a contract for a contract that exceeded, that went about 50% over cost, and that you expressed that is probably out of line with what you would normally like to see, and that would not be in your practice. Did I state that all very well? I kind of said it all for you.
Right. I think you got the highlights of it. One of the issues they had with the digging into the details of the contract, this was a paving contract, and much of the change order work was related to drainage work that probably should have been incorporated into the original design, but wasn't. And I think in the future we are spending more effort doing design work and making sure that these issues are caught ahead of time so we don't do these large change orders.
Great, and I thank you for that, and appreciate you doing your due diligence and closing out this old item. Thank you. That's it.
Okay, Rochelle.
Yeah, 510 is the operational and organizational assessment of the city's finance department, and I've spoken to this before, that I think it's very important that we provide really good, really accessible and understandable financial information for the general public. I think we do a very good job with our, the audited financial statements are quite good, but they're still financial statements that are not necessarily interpreted for the public as well as they might be. And along with that, I think it's important that we have some citizen oversight of the financial functions. So I would like to, I don't know if this was discussed in the development of the contract, but I would certainly love to see that when we talk about the key programs here, where we talk about communication with other departments and so forth, that we include communication with the public. And I guess the oversight function is that's something that we take up when we talk about the different committees that we have. But for this purpose, I'd like to have public communications included in the scope of work, if that makes sense to everyone else.
Are there any members of the public that wish to pull an item? Seeing none, could we get a motion to approve the consent calendar?
So moved.
Seconded.
Pull the council, please.
Councilmember Barnes?
Yes.
Councilmember Moss?
Yes.
Councilmember Pilch?
Aye.
Vice Mayor Nason?
Yes.
Mayor McQuaid?
Yes, and the motion carries. Good of the city. Good of the city is a time for persons desiring to address the city council on an item that is not on the agenda. Please note, city policy limits each speaker to 3 minutes. The Brown Act limits the council's ability to take and/or discuss items that are not on the agenda. Therefore, such items are normally referred to staff for comment or for a future agenda. Is there any public comment? Seeing no one, we'll move on. Council member reports on meetings attended, announcements of future meetings, city manager report and comment. You want to go first?
Sure. You'll see in the packet the 3 meetings that I attended between our last council meeting and tonight. These are end of the year meetings. There wasn't a lot on any of these agendas that were particularly, I would say, relevant. Perhaps the most interesting one was the first one, the Future of Freight Roundtable, Goods Movement in the Bay Area, which was a unofficial gathering of city, county, state, regional officials to talk about how we're going to get our goods movement up and running to a higher level. The Port of Oakland serves the Northern California and is, I guess, the 3rd largest port in California, and it's a major economic driver. So the County Transportation Commission, which sponsored this, is very gung-ho on making the port more efficient. And in fact, today I was at a programs and projects meeting where the whole meeting was essentially based around a grade separation that's going to go on at the port. Cost about $500 million, and will be highly dependent on SB1 funding, Regional Measure 3, which will presumably be on the ballot next fall, and right now has maybe less than 10% of it funded, but going forward will require a lot of money. So
what's a grade separation?
the grade separation is, if you, an example would be when you cross the railroad tracks on Gilman, there's a proposed grade separation there where it would be essentially a road underpass under the tracks, and it would make freight and trains run more efficiently.
Right, and it would get rid of those annoying whistles which they're required to blow under federal law.
What's that?
If you have grade separation, they don't have to blow the whistles, and we'd be getting a lot of complaints about
If
the
they're
whistles.
totally separated, yeah, but I think they're blowing the whistle for more reasons than just car traffic. But that's a whole different discussion. Anyway, I've said enough.
Any other council members have reports? Start with you.
Yes, yeah, about the East Bay Community Energy Board. Neither Pete nor I were actually able to make the December meeting, unfortunately, and we neglected to tell Claire that she could have gone as well. But fortunately, it was mostly. There's not a lot of substance, but there are a number of things happening around that I just wanted to mention. Number one, you may have received an email that is asking you to make sure you oppose some legislation that would make it more difficult for CCEs to form. And that would be a good thing to oppose, but our CCE, EBCE has already been accepted by the folks in Sacramento, so we're not in danger. But if you do feel like you want to oppose that, I think I sent the mayor information about this in December. Also, they're going full bore on implementation. We'll have an expanded meeting schedule in January and February, where we'll have 3 meetings coming up. And they really want to start enrolling municipal accounts, as I've mentioned to Claire and others. Was it in April? Or it's as soon as possible. It's either April or June. And they want to get the municipal accounts, such as ours, and other business accounts enrolled, to start to generate revenue as quickly as possible. And I believe we will have the option of enrolling and deciding the power mix that we want to sign up for. So that will likely be coming down the pike. So lots of stuff happening with EBC.
Thank you.
Well, let's see. We've had at least a couple of Altabates meetings since the last meeting of this body. Probably the most important thing to know is that there is a community forum planned for February 3rd at the Ed Roberts campus at the Ashby BART station, and people are encouraged to consider attending and otherwise getting active on the issue because we do face the closure of Altabates Hospital as well. In fact, it has, in some sense, a portion of it has already begun. We've already lost services at Altabates that are important to our community. The other thing I have done, I attended the East Bay Regional Park District's Policy Advisory Committee meeting on dog policy. They had issued a draft policy regarding a study of environmental issues around dog walking at the bulb. So I commented that, reminding them that the bulb is still a City of Albany issue we're working on very actively, and that the community is going to want to have discussions and input into any dog policy that will come out of the process.
Okay, I attended the Alameda County Transportation Commission, the Everyone Home Leadership Board, the legislative breakfast at the Alameda County Food Bank, and the mayor's conference. Do we have an interim city manager report?
Yeah, a quick one for you. I'm excited to let you know that Lime Bike is coming to town. We expect them to launch here in Albany and El Cerrito by the end of the month. Again, for everybody's remembrance, this is a bike sharing program. You download an app, you rent a bike, and it's a dockless program. So there are certain locations where you can park your bike afterwards and the bike is self-locking, We will have staff monitoring the effectiveness of this bike share program within Albany, so I certainly welcome comments as you see these deployed, particularly if you see any issues with where they're being located. Some good news on Peggy Thompson Pierce Street Park. PG&E has fulfilled their obligations to put the electricity in. We have 3 benches that have arrived at Public Works that will be installed shortly. And we anticipate the plaque arriving by the end of the month, looking forward to a park opening hopefully in February, but we'll certainly keep you posted once we have that date refined. Another event that launched today is our Commit to Serve Expo. Wander by the community center and you can't miss it. It is our respect and duty to commit to serve here in Albany to local nonprofits, and there's a bunch of information available to the community. I'd also like to acknowledge some new staff that we've had over the holiday break. We have Sarah Shallcross in our finance department, a part-time employee as an accounting technician, and also Vanessa Skilden, who is a program leader 3 in the senior center. That's it, thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, that brings us down then to 10.1, Local Hazard Mitigation Plan for 2018-2022. May we have a staff report, please?
Hi, good evening, Mayor McQuaid, members of council. Before you tonight is the final draft of the city's local hazard mitigation plan for 2018 through 2022. The city is required to update our local hazard mitigation plan to be eligible for FEMA grant funding for hazard mitigation planning. A local hazard mitigation plan is a tool for addressing disasters before they happen. The ultimate goal is to reduce the potential loss of life, property, and natural resources during and after a disaster. We see this as a necessary part of resilience and adaptation planning and believe this conversation is particularly timely given the unprecedented natural disasters that occurred in 2017. It's important to note that the plan is for mitigating hazards, and preparedness, response, and recovery aspects of emergency management are addressed in our emergency operations plan, which is a separate document. We began the planning process by discussing this with the Sustainability Committee at several of their public meetings to gather community input, and we also conducted a survey to determine the community's level of concern for potential hazards and their understanding of emergency preparedness. We identified potential natural and human-caused hazards. We assessed risks and vulnerabilities associated with those hazards, and developed long-term strategies for protecting people and property from future hazard events. Staff then prepared a draft local hazard mitigation plan using guidance from ABAG, the Governor's Office of Emergency Services, and FEMA, and brought that plan to council back in October for feedback. In preparing the plan, we considered a wide range of hazards. While we're only required to address natural hazards, we did decide to include some human-caused hazards as well. And ultimately, based on input from council and from the community, we chose these 10 hazards, and then you'll see some have sub-hazards as well that are all addressed in the plan. We also conducted a risk assessment where we determined the probability of occurrence and potential impact on people, property, and the economy for each hazard, and ranked them based on this analysis. There is a table in the plan. This is a small snapshot of the entire table that outlines strategies for mitigating each hazard, establishes the responsible agency for implementation, and designates a timeline for each measure. The final plan before you has feedback that's been incorporated from your last council meeting, also from the community and the police and fire departments. From the last council meeting, we added sea level rise and information technology infrastructure failure into the hazard section. We also made edits to the mitigation strategies, including additional strategies and strengthening language to address soft story buildings for earthquake safety. We also made revisions to the list of critical facilities. And then we made 3 minor edits to the plan from the version that's included in the original packet. And those, I'll go over those briefly. So we moved a heading to the correct page on page 29. It was just a minor error. And then we also updated, we corrected the dates in this table for Bay Area earthquakes on page 19. There's some confusion about the dates. And then we updated this graph for visual clarity. So we actually changed the graph to make it more clear and so that you can read all the headings. So those are the 3 changes that you might not have seen when you reviewed the plan. In terms of implementation, the City of Albany Community Development Department is the lead, will take the lead responsibility for monitoring the plan's progress, but plan implementation and evaluation are actually shared responsibility over many of the city departments, as well as other agencies that are identified as lead agencies in the plan. After FEMA approval, staff will develop an implementation plan and will meet with departments at least annually to track progress. So our next steps, after the plan is approved, we'll submit it to the California Office of Emergency Services for review, and they will actually send it to FEMA for approval. We will then implement the plan and conduct a comprehensive update every 5 years. So that concludes the presentation. I welcome your questions and feedback. Thank you.
Are there questions from council? Michael?
This is a little peripheral, so the mayor's can stop me if she likes. How in this process are improvements tracked? For example, there's been this countywide program to offer subsidies for, earthquake safety, reinforcing cripple walls so do we know how many people in Albany took advantage of it? Do we know to what extent our housing stock is more earthquake proof than it was 5 years ago? Is there any way to track that?
I'm not sure. I can check in on that. I do know that the update process itself will incorporate some of that. So in 5 years, we'll take a look at which mitigation strategies we actually implemented, and if so, we'll look for any data that's relevant to determine if they've been successful.
And seismic retrofitting requires pulling a permit, I do believe. I know I had to pull a permit when I did mine. So it probably,
we could
data
access that
probably
data.
exists, yeah.
I think the point is, in general, in addition to meeting FEMA's requirements for grant funding, is to make the city safer. And it would be nice if there was some parallel mechanism that, monitored that as well. In all your spare time.
Kind of just a technical question, I suppose. We're doing this in part because if something were to happen without this plan, we would have a very difficult time getting funds from FEMA to rebuild or repair. It's a FEMA requirement, essentially.
The requirement is actually for FEMA funds to have grants for hazard mitigation itself. So it doesn't, if we don't have the plan, if we had a disaster, we could still be eligible for, my understanding is we could still be eligible for FEMA funding for the disaster. It's more a plan to focus on
Mitigation.
trying to lessen the impacts of a disaster
Okay.
or prevent it from happening.
All right. So once this is submitted to FEMA, what's the timeline usually for getting something like this?
I don't know the answer to that. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Would we, at that point, be able to start applying for monies for mitigations?
It has to be approved by FEMA before we can be eligible for those grant funds.
Okay. Thank you.
Other questions? I do have one question. You talked about evaluating in 5 years, but then somewhere else it says every year. So every year do we kind of look at it sort of high level?
Right. So internally, we have kind of an action plan and a timeline. And so we'll do annual check-ins with each department that's responsible for mitigation strategies. So that's sort of our internal implementation plan. The updated every 5 years is a FEMA requirement. So we actually have to do a whole new public process and update the plan and add new mitigation strategies.
And will council see the internal check in?
If council's interested in receiving an annual report on progress, we'd be happy to do that.
Okay. Are there any public comments? On it?
I forgot my card. Alan Maris, Albany resident and a member of Diverse Housing Working Group. What is the status of the non-reinforced concrete buildings along San Pablo?
I'm sorry, I don't know the answer.
I don't have any specific information on numbers. There was an inventory done maybe 15, 20 years ago, and a very large percentage of those got retrofitted, but not all of them.
So many of them have been reinforced. Is that what I heard? Yes. The ones that haven't, is there some way we could combine the funding we have for affordable housing with improving those buildings so that they meet the earthquake standards, and we maybe get some funding for both affordable housing and the restoration of those buildings?
It may be a separate agenda item to go into the details of a seismic retrofit program. It is something that's in your strategic plan for us to work on. I am anxious to bring that back to you. This report will not likely generate those kinds of funds to improve private property. I think this is more oriented towards public infrastructure and public agency preparedness, our water lines, our bridges, and so forth.
While you're up there, could I ask, do we have a kind of wish list at this point of things that we're expecting to apply for FEMA funds, and how much funding is available to?
I think this report kind of specifies, is in a sense, a start of the wish list. I don't know offhand what kind of funding is available out there for us. I haven't seen a lot of grant programs related to this right now, but maybe, Claire, you've been paying more attention.
There is a grant program that's open, but it closes in late January, so we're missing the boat on it. But I think they come up pretty often. I don't have a number amount.
And are you applying directly to FEMA for this grant money, or are you having to go through MTC or some state?
The grant funding that I saw recently is either through the California Office of Emergency Services or FEMA. I can't remember.
If you just said something, I didn't hear what it was.
Ask her if she knows about grant funding. Okay. Seeing no one else, I'll bring it back to council for comments. Nick, go ahead.
Okay, sure. Just one small thing. I was trying to search for mitigation and response everywhere in the document and noticed that some of those headings seem to be graphics instead of text for some reason, and I wasn't able to search for them. There's probably some good reason for that, but we might want to revert them back to text so they can be searchable.
Yeah, I didn't realize that. I'll check in on that.
Okay, and so three other comments. When it talks about energy shortage or energy failure, I think we do need to incorporate, and this is fairly new now, but we do need to incorporate the consideration of the fact that we will have our CCE coming online, which should provide us, hopefully, with some resiliency around that. If we have more local generation and we can keep our generation is within the grid, hopefully that'll mitigate mitigate some outages. I'm not certain about that, perhaps, but it should be investigated. We did mention the Solano Stroll and potential issues around attacks on the Solano Stroll, but I did not see a mention of the measures that we had already put in place, such as this year we put the barriers in the middle of the street, and so I think we want to mention that we have been proactive about that, and that I assume we'll continue to be proactive about that. And then finally, in combating severe weather, it's likely, there's nothing directly we can do to stop severe weather, but I think it's worth mentioning that we can still play our part by addressing climate change, and that is, there's a consensus that it's a likely cause of a lot of the severe weather. So adding that in there would be good as well. And that's it for me.
I just thought it was a good job. I have a number of little, small things here and there where something was missing. But on the whole, I thought it was very readable, and I was pleased.
I'll add to that. I just think the staff did a great job in bringing us this document and incorporating all the changes that came about after the last one. I do have a couple of different changes, though. Looking at on page 64, the boxes. In the second box, where it's talking about all hazards, I'd like to see us include the word business. Further down in that same all hazards, the seventh box referring to Altabates, I have different language. And Rochelle, you might want to make sure I've got this now. Advocate to keep Altabates Summit Medical Center open in Berkeley as an acute care hospital, including emergency care.
Sounds good.
The in Berkeley is now critical to the discussion. And then the last one, in the earthquake, the fourth box, I'd like to change the date to 2018 rather than 2019. We now have a disaster preparedness working group working with the fire department, different community members and organizations. And since it's happening now, I think we can update that to 18. Any other comments?
Well, just, again, I think it was a really great job, and I appreciate all the work that went into this. And I'm sort of looking forward to seeing what comes out of it in terms of potential funding and funding sources for the city and some of the infrastructure needs that we, are going to have to deal with. So, maybe in a year or once this has been approved, we can revisit it, see what we're looking at.
I will mention a couple of those things that I noticed as well, since people are bringing them up. I noticed that with the pandemics, there was no mention of the hepatitis A outbreaks that we've had in California, and that are certainly a risk here. Also, I wanted to mention urban forestry. You did mention Albany Hill, and the the team talked about the trees on Albany Hill. I think it's important to remember, especially as a severe weather risk, that some of the street trees that Albany maintains and provides on its parking strips are very vulnerable to severe weather and can be very dangerous if they fail, and that we should think about severe weather when we are thinking about our urban forestry.
Any other comments from council? Could I get a motion, please, to adopt Resolution 2018-2?
So moved.
Second.
Poll the council, please.
Councilmember Barnes?
Yes.
Councilmember Moss?
Yes.
Councilmember Pilch?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Nason?
Yes.
Mayor McQuaid?
Yes. And the motion carries. 10-2, update on implementation of non-binding rent review program. May we have a staff report, please?
And Mayor, I'll be recusing myself from this, so please call me back in from the room in a minute.
Bottom right. Bottom right. Right, right. One more. One next to the bar. No, one more.
Good evening. So the item before council is an update on the implementation of a non-binding rent review program ordinance. Staff is requesting council authorization to develop the first draft of a non-binding rent review program ordinance. The development of a rent review program ordinance is a goal within the City Council strategic plan in support of the objective to promote housing availability. So I'll go over briefly what has been done in the past. Over the last several months, Council has been receiving information and providing direction on the implementation of a non-binding rent review program. Council received a presentation from the Social and Economic Justice Commission on October 3rd, 2017, and received, 2016 actually, and received public comments. On November 16th, 2016, staff held a workshop on policy questions associated with the rent review program, and an online survey was also used to get input. On December 5th, Council received an update from staff on the input received from the public workshop, and also received input from the public. At the March 6th Council meeting, 2017, Council authorized the release of a RFP for rent review program services and provided further direction that staff should handle the RFP process and present findings to Council, whether the ordinance would contain consequences for interested parties who failed to attend a scheduled rent review meeting, research the availability of rent data for Albany, having rent review meetings in Albany, and whether there are nonprofit organizations that could respond to the RFP, and that the Social and Economic Justice Commission have a role in vetting the ordinance. So the rest of the staff report will provide an update regarding the RFP process, results of research conducted to date by staff regarding a rent review program for Albany, including several key programs elements to be considered in creating a rent review program. Protections for tenants and landlord, existing rent data and sources, and information on rent review program services that can be provided by nonprofit organizations. So as far as the RFP update, it was released, the RFP was released on April 28th with a deadline for submissions on June 16, 2017. The RFP was sent out widely through the Alameda County Housing and Community Development listserv. We received one submission, and it did not sufficiently meet the components of the RFP. Key elements of a non-binding rent review program. Staff has researched local rent review programs to gain a better understanding on how a rent review program can be customized for Albany. Several key elements are to be considered in the creation of an implementation phase. Elements include trigger for rent review, number of days to file a request, number of days for landlord to respond, consequences to landlord or tenants for failure to respond, and the staff report has a list that goes on about key elements to be considered. As far as tenant and landlord protections. There was no clear consensus from the workshops of survey responses on tenant and landlord protections. Further research and direction is needed on this. Of note, the governor has put in place a statewide protections against price gouging following the North Bay fires through April 18, 2018. These protections prohibit raising the price of consumer goods and services, including rents, by no more than 10%. As far as rent data, staff did some preliminary research on rent data. According to the Association of Bay Area Government, which is ABAG, they provided a report and called the San Francisco Bay Area State of the Region 2015. And between 2000 and 2014, counties with the greatest growth in employment in technology-related fields experienced the largest percentage increase in average rents. So here you see the different counties that have had the highest increases, and Alameda County is included in that list at 34%. The report also shows the top 10 jurisdictions with the greatest increase in median gross monthly rent between 2010 and 2013. Albany, as you can see, is number 10 on the list with a 15% increase. Staff also used data from the U.S. Bureau of the Census American Community Survey 5-year, the ACS 5-year, to show recent changes in gross rents in Albany. So the chart here demonstrates the number of units paying rent over 5-year periods, and how many renters are paying for rent for each of the categories. And of note, UC Village, which according to the city's housing element has a strong and noticeable influence on demographic data for the city as a whole, includes 974 1-, 2-, and 3-bedroom apartments. And in 2017-2018, rents range between $13.91 for a 1-bedroom and $21.42 for a 3-bedroom. And UC Village rental units represent approximately 23% of Albany's rental stock. More data, staff, according to the city's the City of Albany's 2015-2023 housing element, a household is considered to be overpaying for housing if it spends more than 30% of its gross income on housing. Data from the ACS survey shows that the percentage of renters paying more than 30% of their income in Albany on rent is increasing. Staff reached out to Echo Housing, which provides alternative dispute resolution to tenants and landlord in Alameda County and administers non-binding rent review programs in San Leandro and Union City. Echo's scope of work is attached for your information. And lastly, in preparation for this item, staff did meet with members of the Albany Property Rights Advocates, attended a diverse housing working group, and the Social and Economic Justice Commission to inform all of them of the next steps associated with the implementation of the non-binding rent review program ordinance. As for next step, pending council direction, staff would prepare a draft non-binding rent review program ordinance and the detailed structure of the program. The first draft of the ordinance would be presented to the Social and Economic Justice Commission in March 2018, and a presentation to City Council in April or May 2018. No cost is associated with the writing of the ordinance, and funding for the program would be incorporated in the draft fiscal year 2018-19 operating budget. So with that, I'm available for questions.
Are there any questions from council? Okay.
Michael, go.
Because University Village has such a high weight in our statistics, do we know what has happened to rents in University Village? Were they higher or lower than other rents, other rent increases?
Yeah, it's really hard to tell because we haven't done that comparison between UC Village rents and other rents in Albany.
Yeah, I'm not sure how, of course, when you deal with UC Berkeley, it's quite a bureaucracy, but they just might have those numbers. The second issue is our consultant for the general plan's name is Barry Miller. We're getting some nodding. I got that right? Okay. He did an interesting article in a local planning magazine about the popularity of rent review programs. It might be worth just calling him up and asking for his advice or opinions or what the word is on the street about where to go for expertise.
Questions?
Yeah, Michael kind of touched on the basic question I was going to ask about if there's any way you can separate UC Village from the rest of Albany, because UC Village, after all, is for students. It's a little more restrictive as to who they're renting to. But then another question came up in my mind as he was asking his. Has anyone ever inquired how UC Village sets rent? I mean, is there a process that the university goes through to determine, so much for, one bedroom, so much for a two bedroom, et cetera? Do they base that on market surveys? Do they? It might be interesting to know, because they are sort of the big gorilla in the room in Albany. So how are they getting, making that determination?
Sure. Yes, we can find out.
Yeah.
Any questions?
No.
So I have several questions. Is UC Village included in the chart?
Yes, because it's part of the census tract.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. And I think you don't have this information, but I just thought it was kind of interesting that there seemed to be less units, and that there was a drop in total rents. And I'm wondering if that's because there's less units to be rented, or if it's just.
Yeah, it's hard to. We can only make assumptions. Based on this.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about what the fee from landlords for each residential property might look like if we choose to go down that path?
Right. So for the only city that I know that charges right now a fee to fund a rent review program is the city of Union City, and they charge $21.50 per unit. That goes specifically to fund the rent review program.
Per year?
Per year, yes, per unit per year. Mm-hmm.
And it talked about registering landlords, but aren't they already registered to the business license program?
In the city, yes.
So that wouldn't really be. Mm-hmm. And then looking at how much time there is to file either as a tenant or as a landlord, it's relatively short, and I'm wondering, which I think is good, but I'm also wondering if there's any exemptions if perhaps somebody was in the hospital or they were on vacation, if that's a consideration.
Yes, there could be a good cause good cause can be included, such as illness or time away from the office unexpectedly, or yes, those causes could be included.
Great, thank you. Okay, how many do we have to speak tonight on this? Okay, Ann will read 3 names if you could line up, and we'll try to get through this as efficiently as possible.
If you haven't turned in one yet, if you can bring it up as you come up to the podium. First one will be Ed Crowley, Peter Campbell, and Kathy Deal.
Hi, I'm Ed Crowley. I own a 7-unit apartment building for about 34 years now. How can the City of Albany can't trust the Social and Economic Justice Commission to develop a fair implementation plan for a written mediation program in Albany. How can you relegate input on an issue that this council is assigned to the community time and time again? It's not about rent control from an organization that is wholeheartedly committed to rent control. Remember back when you assigned them the task to determine the feasibility of non-binding rent mediation? They first held meetings without notifying any Albany property owners. Then when the property owners were given notice and showed up, the commission dismissed what we told them. Instead, they stuck to their inapplicable or inaccurate information and figures, presumably because it supported their goal of implementing rent control. Throughout, the commission acted as if spiraling rents were an emergency situation that required immediate attention, but never did they present any evidence of such a condition. The commission never reached out to tenants or property owners to find out whether they were successfully working together to mitigate the impact of rising rents. The commission, we came to the commission's meetings and we told them, we brought evidence that for prices of new vacancies that were way below the figure of $3,100 that they were quoting as the average rent in Albany. We were showing them that rents for new vacancies were way below that. Further, our own survey showed rents being even farther below that for occupied units. And did any of that end up in the report? No, they just ignored it all. They didn't want to hear from us. That makes me believe that the commission chose to cherry pick its number to make its case for rent control look good. In one hearing, one commissioner said that most landlords don't have business licenses and others nodded in agreement. Does the city agree with that statement? Throughout, commissioners repeatedly claimed that they weren't proposing rent control, but when cornered with their own statements, they had to admit they were. Most of the commission members regularly attend council meetings, introduce themselves as commission members, and encourage the council to enact rent control. To my mind, this is an admission of bias, as if it wasn't evident from their work. The commission cannot be trusted to prepare an unbiased and authoritative plan for implementing something as complex as rent mediation. You should form a new commission whose task it is to do that. This new commission should be comprised of the stakeholders of the issue, including property owners, whose input on this matter the SEJC has constantly rejected and/or ignored. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Peter Campbell from APRA, Albany Property Rights Advocates. And I just wanted to comment on a few points in the staff report. In the summary section, it's pointed out the stated objective is to promote housing availability. Now, rent review does nothing to promote availability of housing. Only more housing can do that. Under staff recommendation, the council is to direct staff to develop the first draft of rent review program in coordination with the SEJC. Shouldn't coordination with APRA also be included? In the background section, some tenants suggested mediation by a clients committee. This is on the workshop you had. We believe it may be difficult, if not impossible, to find a qualified citizen community, whatever that is. Also, it is proposed that SEJC have a role in vetting the draft ordinance. We propose that owners and APRA have a role in any vetting process as well. Under the discussion section, under elements section of the discussion section of the report, it's proposed that housing providers pay a fee to cover the cost of any rent review program. Since the rent review program is supposedly intended to benefit renters as well as benefit renters, we believe they should share in the cost at least on an equal basis with housing providers. Under the rent data section, it is not clear that the data cited is actually relevant or has been adequately evaluated. We believe any available data be completely evaluated by persons qualified to accurately interpret such data. I tried to access the source information referenced in the staff report and found a huge, confusing website. One interesting statistic I did find in the staff report was a chart that showed median rents have barely budged since 2009 in spite of the vacancy rate declining by about 50%. Also, the percentage of renters paying more than 30% of their income, and by the way, we agree that this is too much to pay, more than 30%. The percentage of paying more than 3% on rent has barely moved since 2009. Rent review does nothing to change this statistic, only increasing the housing supply will help. Under the next steps section, staff anticipates presenting the first draft to SEJC. We believe it should also be presented to APRA as well to balance the input you receive. Thank you.
After Kathy Dio will be Francesco Papalia, Ian Bennett, and Evelyn St. Louis.
Hi, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak this evening. I prepared some notes for you that you can reference. I'm not going to be following these exactly, but you'll have these for the future. Excuse me. Well, I'm really happy that we're moving ahead now with the rent review process after experiencing several delays. I wanted to voice some concerns I had regarding the staff report before we get started in development of the ordinance, so that they will be taken into consideration at that time. Page 2 of the staff report list various areas which were designated as being part of a general consensus based on the workshop data and the online survey. And I did a more in-depth analysis of that data and found that some of this information is maybe a little askew. For example, one of the items that is indicated that there's a consensus on is the trigger for rent review, that it should be at an increase of 10%. But when I examined the data more closely from the workshop, and particularly from the online survey, and you'll find that on page 2 of what I've just handed out to you. Did everybody get one of these?
Yeah.
You need some more? Okay. Particularly under the online survey results, it looks as if the 10% would be the choice, the preferred choice, because the majority of people who responded did choose 10%. However, when you're talking about a consensus, you're not talking about a majority. You're talking about some kind of a somewhat quasi-agreement that you reach amongst all of the participants. And so if you break down the data by the group in which the responder identified with, which was either a tenant landlord or someone that declined to state whether or not they're a landlord or a tenant, you'll find that 24 tenants.
Kathy, you're going to need to quickly wrap this up.
Okay, 24 tenants out of 34 stated that they would prefer either a 5% or a 7.5% increase, not a 10%.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks. You'll see what else I have.
Right, thank you for preparing that for us.
Good evening. I'm Francesco Papalia, speaking for the Albany Property Rights Advocates. Words matter, and we would like in the future, in this ordinance get written, that you use the word housing providers instead of landlords and residents for tenants. That already sets up a dynamic which I think would be more healthy. Another thing is that we want to remind you that this whole issue is about a housing shortage, which has been indicated quite clearly in the graph that you brought, where there's a vacancy rate of 2.1, which is the lowest that it's been in almost 10 years. So we need to build more housing, not find ways of restricting or discouraging the implementation of new housing providers. EPRA should be a stakeholder, as a real stakeholder in the city, to parting of writing the ordinance, and we should be consulted because we have most experience in this. And as for the funding of it, it was determined that this is to be done for the good of the city. And I believe that everyone in the city should be paying for it. That would mean that it would come from the general fund, that the people who own their houses and the businesses are all party to this. Placing a burden for this on the people who provide the housing is unfair and should be like any other tax or fee. If it benefits the entire city by promoting the values that you want to promote, everyone should participate in that payment. Nothing in this report has anything to do with, echoes actual average cost to implement one of these mediations. Is there a way to get that information? I think you should be provided with what a typical mediation would cost. They just give general numbers like $70 an hour for this, $100 for that. Does that come out to average of $1,000 or $1,500 per mediation? Let's see, what else? Another important thing we want to emphasize that as this proceeds is that when you start using words like tenant protections for replacement of words like providing relocation expenses of just cause eviction, that is a kind of rent control, and we consider it that. And please don't use those tenant protections as part of this. Thank you.
Francesco, I have a question for you. When you were talking at the very beginning about the words, what did you use instead of tenants?
Residents.
Okay, thank you.
Ian Bennett?
Good evening. My name is Ian Bennett Goldberg, and I'm with the Albany Property Rights Advocates. I just want to take an opportunity to say that I think that despite the fact that we have had certainly some disparate and at times divisive debate on this issue over the course of the last year or so, that at the end of the day, there's a shared common concern, which is the desire to see improvements in housing conditions and the overall housing situation in Albany, because regardless, that benefits everybody. The point that I think APRA is consistently trying to make is that they don't want to be, we do not want to be left out of the formal aspects of this conversation. We have had a number of discussions with tenants, with other landlords in the community, with city management, even with members of the Social and Economic Justice Committee on a one-on-one basis. And while we may disagree on some points, those discussions have, from my mind, been very effective and very fruitful in developing both sides of the coin and both sides of the idea. And if there's anything that our society and certainly the city are based upon, it's upon having everybody have their opinions and their voices heard and considered and debated. And so when you hear objections from APRA to things like the city management, the city staff report, quote unquote, submitting their proposal for SEJC review and then taking that upon review to the city council, what you're really hearing is you're hearing concern that one side of this coin and one voice will be heard above the other. And so I think that there is a real opportunity here if the city council gives due consideration to the concept of a special committee to tackle this issue that is comprised of stakeholders from both sides of the aisle. That can go a long way to making sure that you have accurate, agreed upon proposals that the city council can then really take under submission. I believe that was the goal of the RFP, which unfortunately did not work out. But I think that that can still be achieved if we undertake this in a joint fashion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Evelyn St. Louis, and I'm a member of the Diverse Housing Working Group and the representative for Solano Community Church at DOG. Thank you for having this meeting tonight. I just wanted to express support for moving forward with the rent review, exploring of writing the ordinance. And I'll keep it short, but basically I think that this is a really good opportunity for exploring common ground. And as some people have mentioned already, I think this is a ripe time for moving forward on an area of policy where there may be agreement if people's voices are included, but to really take this as an opportunity as common ground for, I think, a fight that a lot of us want to fight. And I would encourage council to look carefully at tenant protections, whatever we call them. I do think that that's going to be an important part of writing an effective ordinance, especially for rent review. And finally, I just want to make a suggestion that there is some additional data on rent available from Zillow. It's publicly available data. It's called the ZRERI. It's quite good, and I'm sure some of the landlords in the room are familiar with it as well. And on that, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Margie Marks. I'm a resident of Albany. In the strategic plan for the city of Albany, which the majority of you voted for in February 2017, it states that the city will develop a rent review ordinance. So I think if you're not going to do that, you should change the strategic plan, but if you are, now seems the time to do it. There is a difference between rent review and rent control. I know the Albany property owners advocates have their own definition of what they consider rent control. I disagree with their definition, as do most housing advocates. Cities with rent control include Berkeley, Oakland, San Francisco. Those cities cite an exact percent by which the rent can be raised. In all three of those cities, the amount allowed last year was based on the Consumer Price Index and was less than 3%. Despite what the property owners say, we are not seeking rent control in Albany. Rent review does not magically somehow turn into rent control. For the cities with rent control, the majority got them through a vote of the population. In the report under the background, staff refers to the public workshop conducted on November 16th and refers to a consensus reached by those attended. I would just like to say, I think the feedback was primarily from the landlords, and I'd like the council to really give appropriate weight to that. If you look at the listing of over 800 landlords in Albany, only 278 list an address in Albany. That means approximately 2/3 of the Albany landlords don't even live here. According to the housing element, over 50% of the population are renters. I know that includes the 23% at the UC housing. Staff also states that if the council directs the staff to get more information on protections, they would be included in a separate ordinance. I think that is not correct, and that we do need a just cause ordinance. If we do not, if the landlord doesn't want to go through the rent review, all they have to do is evict the person. I would be willing to let the landlords write the conditions of just cause. It could be 20 pages long. It could be anything. They could write it. The other issue I want to raise is the trigger amount. 10% is too high. Nobody I know gets a 10% wage increase. 2 cities had a 10% trigger, San Leandro and Concord, recently changed to 7%. Beverly Hills had 10%, changed it to 3%. 26 cities in California now have some form of rent review. The majority do have just cause clauses in them. I would also like to say I personally met with several landlords in my home to talk to them, to get their input. I had hoped, and including one of them was Mr. Campbell, I had hoped that we could come to some consensus, that we could make it, and I want APRA, I think that's how you say it, involved in the negotiations. I want to take a lot of the contentiousness away from this, and I think if we could talk about it a little more, maybe we could do that, and maybe we could come to a better compromise if we could sit down at a table together and work things out. I think Albany's small enough that we could do that, and not go through these really strict things. But if we could just work out compromises among the property providers and the tenants, I think we could do it as a community. Thank you.
Thank you.
Alan Harris, Albany resident. Thank you for allowing me to speak. What I've heard tonight, I think vast majority of our our housing providers would do quite well in a rent review. I think they're very reasonable people. And I also think that the majority of the, what's the word? It's not tenants. Residents. Yeah. Would do quite well as well. So I think we ought to give this a try. I think what others have said is that we maybe need to tweak this a little bit with the participation of both housing providers and residences and advocates for housing. I think that can be done. I'm a little concerned it hasn't been done already, but I think in general we can live quite well with this rent review. The other thing I'd like to say related to this is that we've heard what we really need is more housing. And this potential, this opportunity we have for creating affordable housing with county bond money, we should really work very hard on this to get it going and get it in place. And this is a great opportunity for us to provide affordable housing in Albany. We should take this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have any other speaker cards? Is there anyone else who'd like to speak? Seeing no one, I'll bring it back to council for comment. Joe, do you want to start? No, it was an okay answer.
Not really.
Okay. Well, to join the chorus of what we really need is more housing, I'm happy to do that. What we really need is more housing, and we need it in the Bay Area in general. I've been a firm believer of that for quite a while. When a city or a community considers something like rent review or even rent control, it is at best kind of a stopgap Band-Aid solution to a problem that the community sees is going on of a really rapid turnover of its citizens. And I'm not sure that's happening right now in Albany, but I think a year or so ago it was happening. And I don't have a lot of statistics to go to other than just word of mouth and talking to friends and neighbors who were either experiencing the situation or knew somebody. In general, it's my sense right now that the rental market has calmed down a little bit in the Bay Area and probably has also in Albany. That said, I think that this will come up again because we live in a really desirable area that has a lot of jobs, economic growth, and it's just a place that people want to live. And those pressures create a situation where if we're not producing the housing to match the demand, we're going to have some issues. I do support coming up with something that's probably would be called rent review. I would, I don't like to reinvent the wheel. I don't know that Albany is so different from Union City or San Leandro or some other communities where this is being done that we can't pattern something that we have off of what they're already doing. And given that this is a Bay Area problem, the more in line cities can be with how they address it, I think it'll be less confusing to the public in general. You know, a lot of the things that I see in the packet here, a 7% trigger, well, that could be a 10% trigger. I'm not sure exactly what that number is. Number of days to file for a request or days for a response. It's amazing how closely Union City and San Leandro have kind of paralleled their programs. You know, as for a fee to pay for all this, you know, I think it would have been useful if we had had something in the packet that did explain what a mediation normally costs and what the projected cost could be to the city. And then if we were going to do a fee, would that pay for most of it? Would that pay for half of it? You know, where is the city going to be in terms of, you know, what are we going to have to put out as in general to get a program up and running? There is a benefit, and I understand this argument where if we do something, it should come out of the general fund. But there's also, you know, our highways are funded by, at least in part, by gas taxes, by the people that use the highways. So I'm hoping that the city doesn't have to do the entire funding process of whatever we're going to come up with. You know, this is where I'm not so clear on my thinking, but I think there does need to be some way for all the parties concerned to be putting input into a program going forward. And maybe there's going to be some give and take. Nobody's going to be exactly happy with what we end up with here. But, you know, I think if you can, you know, accept that fact that everyone's going to have to give a bit and someone, in order to be able to take anything out of this, I think we can come up with a decent program. That's my quick reaction right now, but I'll pass it on. I may have some other things to say.
Michael, do you have comments?
Just a few things. First of all, you know, we haven't addressed this issue for several months, but several months ago, I did talk to many renters in town, and as well as some landlords. And the reality is, one, is that I feel as a council member, we're flying blind, that we really don't have a good handle on what rents are and who the landlords, providers are. But it's very clear there are some ethical, conscientious mom and pop landlords and who have done a good job of providing what by any standard would be affordable housing. That happens a lot in Albany, and I want to make sure that in creating a rent review process, we don't mess with that process. I mean, we don't mess with those positive relationships. We want those providers and residents to kind of fly below the radar screen. That process, you know, isn't broken. We don't need to try to fix it. But there were, you know, let's be honest, there are out-of-town management companies who do own properties in Albany, and they jacked up the rents. And I could probably dig back through my emails and find examples of them, and I thought those increases were exorbitant. They did not have the same sense of community that many of our mom and pop landlords do. So there, you know, really were problems, and we need to figure out a way to sort through these problems. One of the things I would have suggested, and I hope our providers, our housing providers don't mind, is that we have some kind of survey when we renew business licenses every year so that we can ask, how much rent are you charging? Because we really don't have any idea. We have never systematically tried to collect that data, so I'm hoping that's something that our landlords, our housing providers would be sympathetic to. about the commission, and what is the preferred acronym for the homeowners association or the providers association? APRA. We don't control you officially. We control our commissions. We appoint the members. They are part of our public process. We can tell them what to do in our kind way. We can't tell you to do anything. So, we can include you and send public information to you, but, we can't really bring you to the table. We can encourage you to come, but so there's a lack of, you would ask for basically some parallelism between how we treat SEJC and your organization, but the parallelism does not exist at an operational level for the city council. So I'm happy to work around that and be very inclusive, but that's just something you need to understand. And finally, I am a little concerned about process here. I don't want to have, we need to hammer out some rules in an ordinance, and I'm a little concerned we're going to have too many cooks. I'm perfectly happy to have lots of review and public discussion and comment and work sessions, whatever is appropriate. But it's a little bit, it's like you can't write a novel by committee, and a lot of public policy, you have to be careful just how big your committee gets, because otherwise it becomes very unwieldy. So I'm not sure what the staff is asking from the council, but I'm just concerned about this issue. And, my feeling is at some point it's better to sort of hash out a draft with very few people who work together intensely, and then open it up to a broader public to get feedback, and then work through an iterative process for improving it. I cannot see this ordinance being written by 50 people simultaneously. It would take forever. And so that's my concerns, and that's all I have to say.
You want to add anything?
Well, just that we have I think there are a few fairly simple things we could give direction on, like the percentage that would trigger rent review. I think that one of the troubling things that we heard when this first came up was people who were receiving rent increases 2 or 3 months after they had just received one. And I think that's one of the issues on this chart. I think that we could fairly easily provide direction on some of these smaller issues, and I think I'm echoing Pete Moss in saying that, I don't see us needing to reinvent the wheel here. We have 2 good models with some fairly limited differences between them, and we could make some choices. If if a consensus has not developed between the advocates for the different sides, we can talk about these and discuss what are reasonable expectations, which is what I hope to see embodied in this, that we avoid for either side being hit with behaviors and changes to rapid fire changes that violate people's reasonable expectations about their living situation or their housing provider situation. But I just assume we hash some of those out and move forward.
Well, I think, first of all, I think we shouldn't keep using the phrase both sides, 2 sides, whatever. That never gets us very far. I like the Union City model a little bit better than the San Leandro model. But what I'm thinking is that might make the most sense is to direct staff to draft an ordinance and bring it to a small, and I think I want to use the word task force because I don't think I want to use committee, comprised of members of APRA, and SEJC for kind of a review, conversation, whatever. And I'm thinking maybe 5 people, 4 or 5 people, not like the 40 people at the Golden Gate Fields Task Force, but a really small group. and come up with something that everyone, as Pete says, nobody's going to be 100% happy, so everybody feels they were heard, their concerns were at least addressed, and that it's a workable situation, and then bring it back either to SCJC, but they would have representatives on the task force, or just bring it directly back to us for sort of final review and comment. That might be a way to include wider viewpoints as we move this forward. So having thrown out a little bit of a different idea, is there any thoughts about that from council?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think, and I would say just the way I would boil that down is, come up with something. I think Union City and San Leandro there are some differences, but, kind of work with those models. And then when we have something, then a task force, as you may, perhaps some members of diverse housing working group might want to be part of that also. And just let them sit in a room and kind of mull it over as to, what could work for them. Now, ultimately, like I say, not everybody's going to be happy. It's almost impossible. We're in a very difficult situation here, but I think we're a small enough city, and I think the property group, I think, is very reasonable in their basic ideas of what they're looking for, and I think most of the tenants that I've talked to are just looking for some kind of security that I think this could, help in offering. So, but first, come up with that kind of basic form and then present it in a way that everybody knows that they're, they can have some input on.
Okay, so yeah, I think we have some consensus. That sounds good. So there will be people on all sides of this issue who will want to be members of this small task force, and I'm thinking no more than 8 people.
Well, SCJC could only have 2 by Brown Act, so I think 2 from SCJC, 2 from APRA, and I think Diverse Housing Working Group's a good idea, 2 from there. It doesn't have to be an odd number. I think 6.
Okay, 6. So, and there should be some mechanism or person appointed for them to talk to about who they want to have on this working group of 6. That's you, Isabel?
Well, we would need to come up with a process for the members to apply and for council to appoint. Is that how you would want to?
You could also have the SEJC at their next meeting appoint 2 people to serve on the task force and then simply submit a letter to the other 2 interest groups for them to self-select and recommend.
I think that makes sense. I think we want to move this forward as quickly as we can. We don't want to get bogged down in, well, who's going to appoint who or whatever. Just, I think that works really well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sounds good.
But I think it's important that before the task force meets, that there's a draft ordinance, so they have something to work off of.
Oh, yes, I would bring a draft ordinance to the task force, for sure.
I'm going to be a bit of a dissenter here. I feel that the SEJC came to us in October of 2016. It's now 2018. And so this has been kicking around and back and forth, and at some point, I think we just need to start making decisions. We have 2 models in front of us, the Union City model and the San Leandro model. Like the mayor, I lean towards the Union City model, although there are some things I'd probably pick from the San Leandro one. But I think they're relatively narrow. I would make this, if this process is to go, my personal preference would be that we just start picking some of those things tonight and get it rolling. But if we are going to go into a new process or mini process, I would just ask that it be very time limited, so we can make this decision at this point, It's well over a year, and it's just time to move on.
Well, I was thinking hopefully one meeting, perhaps two. It wouldn't be a 6-month process or anything.
Well, staff, part of me says 6 months sounds like a reasonable time frame to me. But I mean, but by the time we get something drafted, we get.
I meant not 6 months of the subcommittee meetings. I don't want the meeting.
Well, I guess this is the question. What sort of timeline are we looking at here?
Well, I was planning to bring the first draft of the ordinance at the March SEJC meeting. So instead of bringing it to the SEJC meeting, I would bring it to the newly formed task force. And depending on how that meeting would go, we may need a second meeting. And then, based on the feedback received, probably come back to council, probably at the May meeting at this point, depending on how that first task force meeting goes, but May or June. It may just postpone the process by 1 month.
Could I ask something? Would this be a voting task force or a consensus group? Is this a group that would come back and say, we voted and here's how we voted? Or would this be a group that comes back and says, here are the points on which we were able to agree, and here are the points on which we were unable to agree?
Well, ultimately, I don't think they're the voting group because we're the voting group. And ultimately, we get to say by vote what we want. So the recommendations are generally.
Right, but they could vote on recommendations, or they could come forward with consensus recommendations, saying, here are the things we agreed on, and here are the things we didn't agree on.
Yeah, I think that's what, I don't think we can actually, I mean, Craig could have a different opinion, but we can't set up another committee that has some kind of power like one of the committee.
Well, you could set it up, and you could give whatever instructions you want. I mean, you could request them to provide recommendations with an even number group that may not.
Yeah.
There's a potential they would be deadlocked.
Right.
So I don't know that you're going to know in advance how they're going to go about
and
formulating their report or recommendations.
Yeah, in any case, I think I'd rather hear the recommendations than the thoughts, and at least go through the process, but not necessarily say, 4 of us thought this way and 2 thought that way. There'll be some disagreements.
We could have 3 members from each group, then there'd be 9, just like the Supreme Court.
CJC can't have 3.
That's right. It's not like the Supreme Court.
Okay, so
Process question. So when the ordinance comes back to you, the draft ordinance comes back to you, we will have heard back from the task force at 1 or 2 meetings, and you mentioned that you would like to hear from the task force, hear their comments and what they disagreed on and agreed upon. Do you want that recommendation, those come from staff, or would you like a presentation by the task force?
If speaking for myself, I think I'd like staff to kind of take the recommendations and bring it to us in a bit more condensed form. I don't think we'll need to necessarily hear from everybody, but I think it'll be your responsibility to condense this. And, the other thing I would, as I said before, it would be very helpful to actually get some cost ideas on this, particularly if we're going to be asking property owners to fund it by some fee schedule, or if the city's going to do it. But it'd be good to know what are potential costs, and perhaps ECHO can shed some light on that part of it.
So now I have a process question. These are open public meetings, I'm assuming the task force. Is that right? And so they're publicly noticed, with the caveat that there may be a majority of SEJC members in attendance, so they can attend, although they're not on the task force. Okay. Is there anything I'm missing that you're going to go, oops, we should have done?
No, I think as long as it's the meetings are noticed in compliance with the Brown Act, you're fine.
Okay.
Well, I'm sorry to be a nitpicker here, but if the meetings are noticed, then why can't we have 3 people from each group?
You could do that if you want to notice it as a meeting of the SEJC.
Yeah, but I don't want it to be a meeting of the SCJC. I want to pull it out of that.
Yeah, no, I agree.
opinion.
I just wanted to bring that up, that's all.
Okay, are we ready to listen to what Rochelle's, you look like you have concerns.
Yeah, I have concerns, but I'm just wanting to start making some choices here. But that's okay, I can go with this.
We're not really behind where we would have been. You look at the chart. So does staff have enough direction?
Yes.
Okay.
And just to reiterate, the consensus recommendations is what you would receive back from staff as a result of these meetings, which may or may not indicate that everybody's in line with next steps. And so that will be something the council will need to decide and take action on if there's anything where there are 3 different opinions on something.
Well, here's what I'd like to see. I'd like to see staff's recommendation. I always want to see what the staff thinks that we should do as a matter of policy, having listened to us discuss this many times, or at least a few times. And then I would like to know what things the group was able to reach consensus about, and then the things which they were not able to reach consensus about. I'd like to know the staff recommendation, and then we have another hearing like this, and people can get up and talk about the things that they, the way that they think we should make each of these decisions.
Do we need a motion for this? Can I get a motion, please?
So moved.
I don't think so.
Well,
You want me
I'm not sure, I thought it said in here that you were just looking for feedback, but I didn't realize,
to? Okay, I can try.
yeah, okay, if you think.
Okay, I move that we give staff direction to draft a rent review ordinance to be brought to a task force comprised of 2 members each of the Diverse Housing Working Group, Social and Economic Justice Commission, and Albany Property Rights Advocates. Can I stop there?
And that staff return to you with the outcome of that process.
And staff return with the outcome of that process, including consensus recommendations from the task force.
And per Rochelle's comment, staff comments as well.
Well, they're right in the ordinance. Yeah. Okay, so does that take care of it? Okay.
Okay, I'll second that.
Poll the council.
Councilmember Barnes?
Yes.
Councilmember Moss?
Yes.
Councilmember, Vice Mayor Nason?
Yes.
Mayor McQuaid?
Yes, and the motion carries. And thank you all again for coming tonight. Okay. Oh, we need to go get Nick. He's probably watching. They're eating all the food. Okay, that moves us to new business. The Albany Loop, proposed public artwork on the Ilona Greenway. May we have a staff report, please?
Okay. So it's me again. So the action before the City Council is to authorize the interim city manager to enter into an agreement with Groundworks Office for the creation and installation of the public artwork Albany Loop on the Ohlone Greenway. This item supports the council's strategic plan to develop the Ohlone Greenway recreation and aesthetic opportunities as part of the overall objective to create cultural facilities and opportunities. A little bit of background. On April 4th, 2016, Council approved the Arts Committee's first public art projects plan, which included public art installations as part of the Ohlone Greenway Improvement Plan. One of the public art opportunities was the creation of an interactive play sculpture at St. Gabriel and Portland Avenues. The call for artists was released June 23rd, 2016, with a submission deadline of September 22nd, 2016. A 9-member selection panel consisting of residents and professionals with relevant backgrounds were assigned to review the submissions. And on December 9th, the selection panel recommended 2 artists to the Arts Committee. And on February 13th, 2017, the Albany Arts Committee selected the Albany Loop from Groundworks for the St. Gabriel Play sculpture. Upon selection by the Arts Committee, the artist created a 3-dimensional model of the proposed project. The Albany Loop 3-dimensional model was put on display at the Albany Community Center between April 17th and June 19, 2017. Comment cards and an online form were available for the public to use to share thoughts and opinions about the proposed public art pieces. Over 300 comment cards were received. Additional outreach efforts for receiving community input were also employed. We used social media, the citywide e-newsletter, postcards and flyers at different city events, and we also did a mailing to residential dwellings within 300 feet of the public art site. And on June 12, 2017, the Arts Committee reviewed the community input received, conducted an interview with Brennan Cox from Groundworks, and provided feedback. And on November 13th, Brennan came back with a revised design and color for the interactive sculpture based on the feedback received at the June Arts Committee meeting. And at that time, the Arts Committee unanimously recommended the Albany Loop Public Art for council review and approval. So financial impact, the Albany Loop will be funded with public art funds in the amount of $25,000 approved by council as part of the 2016-2018 Arts Committee Public Art Projects Plan, and Measure WW in the amount of $15,000 approved by council as part of the Ohlone Greenway Improvement Plan, for a total of $40,000. Brennan Cox is here tonight from Groundworks, and he has a presentation for council, and he has more that will provide more information on the actual project. And also Jen Daly, the chair of the Arts Committee, is here to answer any council questions.
Thank you. So do we want the presentation next?
Yes, if you'd like to.
I think so. Come on up. Thank you for coming tonight.
No problem. Thanks for having me. So I can move that one forward there. Great. Thank you for having me. My name is Brennan Cox. I am a partner at Groundworks office. We are a design office just down in Berkeley. I also live in Berkeley, although I try to consider myself an Albany resident because my son and 2 future sons go to the daycare Memorial Park, so I find myself there a lot. When the RFP for this came along, I thought, well, this is a great opportunity to kind of do something in my neighborhood, and we've been really excited to do it. I just thought I'd take you kind of quickly through just our kind of the concept and how we got to where we are right now, and a little bit of our thinking. As a comedic break, I have the other, we submitted like 4 ideas, and I'm just going to quickly show some of the others just because I want them to see the light of day, because we think they're fun. And so as a concept, I'm a relatively new resident of Berkeley, and I use this bikeway almost every day. And when we were developing the concept for what this art piece or sculpture could be, as riding up and down this every day, I always find myself like, am I in Berkeley or am I in Albany? Am I in El Cerrito? There's this kind of like, while it's this delightful path and I value it greatly, there's along this whole length, there's really kind of no there, in my opinion. There are subtle clues that when you're in Albany or when you're in Berkeley, but I thought that would be very kind. Here's one of my clues was the signage I liked. It's like Albany and Berkeley are that way. And there's very little kind of signage, and I'm not about signage that says, here's Albany, but I thought we could do something that's kind of creative that announces announces that you're now in Albany along the Greenway. well, as you can see, these are all my previous photos. We were very fascinated with the BART tracks, as it's really hard not to be. It's this amazing piece of infrastructure, it carries all these people. These were a couple of ideas that are never going to see the light of day, probably, but we thought they were really cool. This was about the creek, and it was about creating that flittering of light that you see off of water, hanging these stainless steel globes off of the BART track that would like pick up these fluttering of light. Never happened. We came up with also this kind of motif about how to let people know as they traverse that path, the creeks that they pass through. And so we're like, gosh, what a great opportunity. We've got these massive concrete things, like let's turn them into something that's like graphic and fun. But the one that got chosen was this idea about what we called the Albany Loop. And I'm sure most of you are very familiar with the site. It's San Gabriel, Portland, and Portland? I'm just blanking. Yeah, Portland. And the site is, relatively nondescript. There's a few mature trees, a few very, immature trees, I guess. And the bike path takes this kind of nice curve there at Portland Avenue. And so what you're looking at here is basically the site, which is around in here. We've encountered a few details that the BART property goes straight there, and we went through a couple rounds of redesign, basically, shall I say, because we were on encroaching on the BART property, and we've since moved back. And so what you see, and so we took this as this opportunity as this kind of site, so to do something very fun, very visual, and take advantage of kind of its place along the Ohlone Greenway. So our proposal, this is a plan of the proposal, is to use a 10-inch diameter steel pipe that kind of weaves its way around the site, and in a way that you could kind of interact with it in multiple ways. And I now fear I don't have the slide that I want. But this idea that we would also spell out the word Albany in kind of a fun way, I guess, but there would be these multiple ways that you could occupy and use the pipe. You could lean against it, you could lean your bike against it, you could imagine little kids like walking along it as a balance beam. But it would serve as this kind of playful element along the Ohlone Greenway. And this is a view looking kind of south of what it might look like. It kind of weaves itself around, it dips it goes into the ground, makes it look like it goes into the ground, and then it kind of comes out. There's a piece here where it kind of goes up and over. And so it's just kind of it has a lot of movement to it. And we think that the color would be very fun and catching. I think that's pretty much it for now. It's very short. I have other drawings that I can show you. We've now kind of started working through the kind of construction detailing of how we're going to build this, which is probably maybe more than you want to know, but we started kind of engineering and figuring out how we're going to build this and transport it and paint it. So I'm done. Oh,
You also have the,
I have a mock-up of that. This is, while this is not metal, it was going to be a little heavy. This is a 10-inch diameter PVC pipe, but we've painted it in the same color that we're proposing. This is it's called Calypso. We're going to be using a direct metal paint. It's going to be slightly glossier than this because there will be a protective coating to prevent graffiti. But it is a very durable marine coating that's going to go in the pipe. And I should just say quickly that the entirety of the sculpture is made up of straight pieces and 90-degree bends. We've done that because it's really hard to bend a 10-inch pipe. Any questions?
Can we argue about the color?
No.
Okay, well, that color is, in the biking world, that's called Celeste. That's the color of Bianchi bicycles. Yeah. It's also called Seafoam Blue. There's lots of different colors. Anyway, I'll let that one go. But another question, more seriously, is Have you ever been or seen photos of Gasworks Park in Seattle?
Sure.
Which is kind of a similar idea. They had this old gasworks, but they painted different parts of it in different colors, so it's visual. It's very fun.
Yeah.
That when I saw that, I'm thinking, yeah, that's like Gasworks Park.
Richard Haig, he's the landscape architect. I know that, very familiar with that place, although it was not in my mind when we were drawing this, for sure.
Okay.
Other questions?
Yeah, more of a hands-on kind of question. So this is a steel pipe, and so will those bends be like L's in plumbing, essentially, that
Yep.
be just sticking together?
They will be, but not like PVC pipe that goes together. They're going to be butted together,
And then,
welded, and
welded.
ground.
Okay,
So you won't see the seam. It won't appear as
okay.
two pipes that have been put together.
And had you considered any kind of lighting on this, or is this going to be?
I would happily light this if we could ask for another $25,000 or something like that.
Okay, thanks.
Nick, do you have any comments?
No.
Rochelle?
I will just add, there will be graffiti sprayed on this, and we have to keep in mind that we're going to have to allocate money to keep it clean.
I realize that, and that's also, we had a number of colors that we looked at for the paint, and my first priority is actually, well, I'm not sure if it is, they're tied, is graffiti, but also the durability of the color. Our original proposal was yellow. When I went to talk to the manufacturer, they're like, yellow paint outside, just no good. It'll chalk and it'll look terrible in 5 years, which kind of led us to the blue. And so we've been very cognizant about how the paint is going to be applied, the type that it's going to be applied, because we're very concerned about that. The paint that we are going to be using, it is a direct to metal. So in the case that if it were ever to be damaged or there is sort of graffiti that would scar or mark the surface, it's very easy to, you'd come back and sand, reapply a primer, reapply the paint. It's not we're not like electroplating it or any of that kind of.
So it's not like a powder coating? No.
Does it get some kind of anti-graffiti coating on it?
Yes.
And am I correct that there's something in the ordinance about maintenance and graffiti abatement sort of stuff?
Yes, as part of the contract,
Right.
We will ask Brennan to provide a maintenance plan.
Right. Rochelle? Nothing?
Say that, it looks good.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
Are there any public, Jen, do you want to say anything? Come on up.
So I just want to say that it's my understanding since joining the committee that this is pretty much the first time that we've been through the new process that we all worked together to create and that the council approved for how to work through one of these projects. And so I think it was a good process, and I really appreciated the input of the community members on the panel that we convened who originally reviewed this. And also, Brennan and Groundworks have just been great to work with. They've come back to us and taken feedback really well and adjusted in response to comments from the community, which was great. And also worked around this Bartland issue that came up, which I really appreciated. I know their flexibility, and I think it was a really good process. And we came up with a fun project that meets our original goals when we looked at the space, which was to create something that is artistic and also fun. And I think this idea of this sense of place that Groundworks brought to this is a cool addition. So I think it's a good project.
Thank you. Any final comments from council? I think it looks really good.
When do we get to dedicate this? Do we have a date for a dedication? Ballpark?
No, not yet. We think, probably, depending on how the process is going to go, that the sculpture will probably be up by July.
Say fall.
Yeah, it's okay.
Fall.
Fall. So
date.
dedication in the fall-ish.
Ish.
Yeah.
Fall, yeah.
Faster than Pierce Street Park.
This will all be prefabbed in the shop somewhere and then brought and installed?
Yeah, our fabricator works in Reno. We're going to have it painted in Reno. It's going to put on a truck, and we're going to bring it down here, and we're not sure how many trips yet.
Big truck.
We're working on through those details.
Okay. No other comments? Can I get a motion to approve?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Poll the council, please.
Councilmember Barnes?
Yes.
Councilmember Moss?
Yes.
Councilmember Pilch?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Nason?
Yes.
Mayor McQuay?
Yes, and the motion carries. Thank you. Thank you both for coming tonight.
Thank you.
In item 12, other business announcement of events, future agenda items. Do we have any future agenda items?
I don't, but it says that the next council meeting will be January 22nd. That's correct? The information that Eileen sent us earlier today takes us to a calendar and a page that does not include that meeting. So I was a little confused.
All right, we'll make sure that happens.
All right.
Okay, so seeing nothing, we are adjourning our meeting tonight in memory of former Albany resident Terry Lamb. Terry and his life partner, Alexa Hauser, lived in Albany for 38 years until recently moving to the Sierra foothills. They both served our community in a variety of ways. Terry was a member of the Community Media Access Committee and was always willing to share his talents and even taught some community video classes. Terry used his art, live theater, and video or film to tell stories, both real and imagined, exploring and documenting the gritty, sweet, harsh, and tender in the human experience was his life's passion. Among his favorite expressions was his work as an actor and board member with Golden Thread Productions, a San Francisco theater company devoted to the Middle East, as well as writing, producing, directing, and acting in video productions, highlighting the work of Bay Area actors and filmmakers. Terry was named the 2016 Albany Artist of the Year by the Albany Community Foundation, who singled him out because of his film, Name, which aired during the Albany Film Festival. Please join me in a moment of silence for Terry Lamb. And with that, we are adjourned.